Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you, especially those who have loyally followed me through 10 lectures, but thank you to all of you for coming along. As we know from metaphors we live by, we know that life is a journey, love is a journey, and also work is a journey. And the 10th lecture is kind of coming to the end of really quite a journey in terms of the material that we've covered. And I don't know whether whether this lecture will give us a destination or whether it will be more a retrospective run along some of the themes that we've touched on in our journey. It will be a little bit of both because I will introduce some new material, but I will start by reviewing some of the themes that we have covered, and in particular, I suppose I want to start with covering a number of the more philosophical issues to do with language, linguistics, and psychology and philosophy of language, which cognitive linguistics raises, and to try to set out my own position, which is not the same as some of the other well-known positions in cognitive linguistics. Let's start by examining what we might call three fundamental philosophies of mind, not just language. The first fundamental philosophy of mind, of course, is of ancient provenance, going all the way back to Plato, and that is the notion that mind is autonomous and exists in its own mental realm. Now, by the way, I am doing this mindful of Western philosophical tradition, but I would be interested if you can tell me about whether these philosophical reflections actually find some kind of parallel in Chinese philosophy of language and mind. The second point of view, so the first point of view we can call a kind of formal idealism. The second point of view we can say is an essentially materialist view of mind, which views mind as being in the brain. Mind is an aspect, maybe mysteriously so, but nonetheless in some kind of way, an aspect of matter and a property of the brain and the embodied nervous system. We can find precursors of this view going back to philosophers such as Spinoza. It was certainly Darwin's view. It was the view of the great psychophysiologist Helmholtz and the founder of experimental psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, and of course many others. Now the problem is, the problem comes when you try to combine ideas which are taken from the first of these with ideas which are taken from the second of these, and you end up with something called the mind-brain, as if these two rather different philosophical positions can actually be combined by dint of a typographical device, just calling it the mind-brain. However, there is also a third notion of mind, which is probably the closest to the one that I've been arguing for in these lectures, although it's not in contradiction to at least the second one necessarily, and that is that mind is in society, that mind is essentially intersubjective and communal, and we can find this in philosophers ranging from the 17th century Italian philosopher Vico through Marx to the later Wittgenstein. So I just say that to point out that the very notion of mind itself is by no means uncontested And incidentally, I'm also aware of the fact that the word mind in English does not actually have cognates in all languages. So when we talk about philosophy of mind, we're not necessarily talking about, as it were, the same entity in all languages. But I do hope that you more or less know what I'm talking about here. Now, going back to the title of this lecture, as many of you know, cognitive linguistics is in part based upon a critique of what is known as the objectivist theory of meaning. And what I want to do first is to set out some of the assumptions and propositions of objectivism in philosophy of mind and language. In general terms, objectivism is the metaphysical position that complete and objective knowledge of the world of a third-person kind, that is to say, knowledge of the universe as existing somehow outside of the intersubjective circuit, and is possible, and that knowledge is essentially non-perspectival. It is objective in the sense of being a knowledge which approximates a God's eye view, okay? A relatively decontextualized form of knowledge. In logic and linguistics, objectivism refers to a formal theory of meaning based upon the objective correspondence between true linguistic expressions and states of affairs in the world. And these states of affairs, again, are supposed to be objective and not, as it were, cast in any particular perspective or point of view. In this philosophy, meanings can be viewed as being a kind of ideal object. So objectivism, in at least its most influential form, is closely related to objective idealism. Linguistic expressions are considered to be decontextualized and to have determinate meaning as ideal symbolic objects. These meanings, sometimes referred to as senses and sometimes referred to as concepts, exist independently of their employment in human communication and practice. There are really only two terms in the objectivist relationship between language and reality. There is language and there is reality, but there is not much room for the speakers of language. Meanings, in fact, must be grasped by subjects whose psychological concepts are imperfect, subjective, and derived. And meaning determines reference according to the classical analysis which was carried out by Frege at the end of the 19th century. Let's just make this a little bit more specific. Meaning is considered to be a relationship of true reference between symbolic expressions and objective states of affairs. Truth is correspondence between propositions and states of affairs. And it is this point of view that was formalized by Carnap. And the general theory takes the form of a proposition P being true if and only if that proposition holds. And the point here is that we have P here in inverted commas means a quotation of the proposition. In other words, the expression P of the proposition is true if and only if the proposition itself holds. So to give an example, the notion is something like that. Beijing is in China, or rather the expression Beijing is in China is true if and only if Beijing is in China. The reference of the expression, according to this theory, is determined by its sense. I'm not going to go into this, but the point is that the sense exists objectively and independently. The sense of a complex expression is built up from the senses of its syntactically combined constituents. And in the current or recent classical cognitivist variant of this theory, which we'll be talking about in a minute, this means that compositionality and productivity of the language system are necessary conditions. And furthermore, the senses of expressions at any level whatsoever, whether these are words or phrases or sentences, are supposed to be invariant across their combinatorial contexts. And this is the notion which Fodor and others call systematicity. What is the relationship between objective sense and concept? Senses, or linguistic concepts for Frege, exist in a Platonic ideal realm. Thus, Frege is an objective idealist. He believes that senses really exist, but he doesn't believe that they are part of, as it were, the perceptible and material world. In order for people to speak, they must grasp the senses. And so senses are non-identical with psychological or subjective concepts. Okay? And this non-identity was actually insisted upon very strongly by Frege, and that's what is often meant by saying that the Fregean philosophy, this version of objectivism, is anti-psychologistic, or it's a philosophy of anti-psychologism. Now, what happens as part of the first cognitive revolution inspired by Chomsky's generative grammar is that you get philosophers such as Fodor, and actually in particular Fodor, who follows Chomsky's move, the move that Chomsky made with grammar, and relocates senses in the individual speaker-hearer in the form of the concepts of an innate universal language of thought. Now, as we were talking about yesterday, or as at least I mentioned yesterday, one of the problems with even understanding the notion of what language is trying to decide, as it were, where we find language. Do we find language in the utterances and speech acts of actual speakers, or is language a property of individual knowledge? According to Chomsky, who's become more and more insistent on this as time has gone on, the real object of study of linguistics is something which he calls the I language, the internal language, okay, inside people's heads. And one of the ways that you can picture this, as it were, is you can say that what Chomsky did was take the traditional view of language that was the view of classical structuralist linguistics, the view of Saussure and others, that language is, yes, objective, but in some sense exterior to hearers and speakers. That's the notion of language as a social institution that I was talking about yesterday. And what Chomsky does is kind of transpose this to being inside the head. Everything is inside the head. And what Fodor does, he actually carries out a parallel move with meaning. He says that meaning, whereas Frege believed that meanings were out there, in a funny kind of out there, you know, a funny kind of way, because for Frege they were kind of Platonic in a special realm all of their own. And then what Fodor does, he preserves their objectivity, but he shoves them all inside the head. Okay? He relocates them in the mind of the individual speaker-hearer. And I should have said, not in the individual speaker-hearer conceived of as a body, but conceived very much as a mind, okay? And they then take the form of the concepts of an innate universal language of thought. Everybody has, the language of thought is what we all have. It's innate, and it's to be distinguished from any natural language. And it works in a way which perfectly follows, unlike natural languages, which tend to be kind of messy and insufficient. They don't behave very well, natural languages. They're not sufficiently regimented. So you've got this kind of internal language, which really is systematic, productive, and totally combinatorial. And what he's done here is he's absolutely followed the logic of the Chomskyan program, and he's turned objective idealism into philosophical rationalism. Okay, and rationalism is basically the theory of innate ideas, and so we've got a kind of formalist, nativist rationalism. But it's also a kind of physicalism, because in contemporary philosophy, philosophers are kind of unhappy with the idea that there should be anything in the universe which doesn't actually have some kind of physical realization. So in classical cognitivism, objectivist meanings exist in the individual mind-brain, as it's often called, in the form of a physical symbol system. The language of thought, both the symbols and the rules of the language of thought, are in there, in my brain and in your brain, as a physical symbol system. But interestingly, they remain independent of actual contexts of human communication and practice. They're not learned because they're innate. They're not variable according to context because they're objective, invariant, and determinate. And in a way, if you ask, so where the hell do they come from? If you reject the idea that God put them there, which is what, you know, the 17th century rationalist would have said, then the only answer you can pose is that somehow biological evolution puts them in there. So evolution replaces God as the guarantor of objectivity. Now, I find this a very bizarre idea, because I think I really don't know how evolution could have done this, but let's not go into that, because the question of the relationship between evolutionary and ecological biology was the topic of yesterday's lecture. All I want to do is say that there are some really serious problems with objectivism. Firstly, it cannot guarantee correspondence between meaning and world. And the philosopher Hilary Putnam, whose work is actually referred to and indeed summarized by George Lakoff in his book Women, Fire and Dangerous Things, has produced a formal proof of this, which Lakoff claims. I'm not much of a logician, I have to say, and I'm not trained as a philosopher, but we have to sort of sometimes take these things on trust. But Lakoff and others claim that Putnam's work is a little bit equivalent to Gödel's proof in mathematics, that it's actually impossible for objectivism to work in the way in which it says it does. But that aside, it cannot explain the workings of real languages in the real world, the way in which real languages involve metaphor, indeterminacies and contextualities of meaning, and polysemy on a widespread level. The only way it can actually, and I talked a bit about this in lecture 3, I think, the only way it can do that, the only way it can come close to an explanation of that is positing very broad general meanings, and of course by saying that that even though the actual languages that are studied by linguists maybe don't do this, nonetheless the language of thought does work according to how it should do. And for me as a psychologist, the most weird aspect of this variety of objectivism is that it simply does not explain how innate concepts get into this entity called the mind-brain. It just says they do. Furthermore, it doesn't just say they do, it says they must do. I mean, this is a logical argument which is basically that's the only way that we can explain meaning is, according to this particular research program, is to suppose that all concepts are innate. Well, you can believe that or not, and I don't. Okay, let's contrast this with subjectivism. So up until now, I have in many ways been following the critical take on objectivism, which I think is shared by everybody in cognitive and cognitive functional linguistics. But of course, traditionally, if we start talking about objectivism, the obvious kind of opposition to this is subjectivism. In the most general terms, in terms of the theory of mind, subjectivism is essentially the epistemological claim that the only access we have to reality is through individual sense perceptions. In other words, the only way the only way that I can make any claims about the world is via my perception of the world, in vision, in hearing, and in touch, and so on. Subjectivism then goes on to claim that concepts are not innate, but are formed through association and through abstraction from particular perceptions. So, through repeated experiences of the same thing, we develop a kind of abstract internal copy of that thing, some kind of representation of all the little bits and pieces which are associated with that thing. And that is essentially empiricism. Empiricism is inevitably, I'm going to claim, a sort of subjectivism because it is based upon the notion of the primacy of sense perception. And linguistic semantics is then assumed to be based upon individual concepts or upon some kind of structure which is similar to concepts, such as image schemas. In the Lakovian view of cognitive version of cognitive semantics, for example. So, actually what I want to claim is that although Lakoff and Johnson do talk about and emphasize in various parts of their writings the fact that the human organism, the embodied organism, is kind of active in the world of experience. Nonetheless, because of this primacy of experience and the notion that that linguistic meanings build upon some kind of abstraction from experience, experientialism, or experiential realism, as Lakoff and Johnson called it, is in fact a variant of empiricism, although they never use that term. And in fact, cognitive linguists are very reluctant to actually concede that the dominant position in cognitive linguistics is a form of empiricism. But I maintain that it is, and that actually the dispute between cognitive linguistics and formalist linguistics, when we take it in the light of the long view of philosophy down the ages, is in effect a rerun of the age-old dispute between rationalism and empiricism. Now, subjectivism, I've run through the problems with objectivism. What you will find less frequently in the text of cognitive linguistics is an acknowledgement of the serious problems with subjectivist philosophies. And here are some of these problems. Now, the first problem is, how can we be sure that the sense perceptions of other people are similar to our own? Supposing I derive my concepts from my sense perceptions, okay, and you derive your concepts from your sense perceptions, how are we going to kind of coordinate them or bring them into some relationship of identity, or at least close similarity? Well, there are answers to that, of course, and in cognitive semantics, the usual answer is that we have common experiences, and a common experience based in particular on our embodiment. Since we all share the same organismic structure in the human body, and the same developmental experiences as we grow from infancy to adulthood, and since we are subject to the same kinds of broad determinations of experience in the world, such as a world constituted by objects, a world in which there is gravity, and so on and so forth, then necessarily, according to this view, we end up with more or less the same image schemata and more or less the same concepts. Well, that's one answer. Whether it's sufficient or not is a bit of an issue, because it still leaves us all, as it were, stuck with our own sense perceptions and concepts in the hope, as it were, that they correlate with those of others. Because another question, the second issue, or the second problem that arises with subjectivism is how can we refer to anything else except our own sense perceptions? We may think we're going around referring in our language to a world outside, but actually maybe we're really only referring to our own sense perceptions or our own image schemas, for example. Now, interestingly, I absolutely don't believe that, but interestingly, in the cognitive linguistics literature, there has been no disavowal of this rather solipsistic notion that language actually refers to mental entities in some kind of way. And there are some cognitive linguists who've actively maintained that. They say, we don't refer to things in the world, we refer to our linguistic concepts or image schemas and so on. Well, I take that to be a problem. And of course, we can even take solipsism one step further and ask, how can we know that the world continues to exist when unperceived? That was a question posed by the radical empiricist Bishop Berkeley in the end of the mid to the end of the 18th century. And it was him indeed, it was Berkeley for whom I think the University of California campus at Berkeley was named, in a kind of rather ironic fact, if it is a fact. Um, so, so Berkeley said, well, given that, the world for me is my sense perceptions, how do I know that the world continues to exist when I'm not perceiving it? Or any bit of it continues to exist when it's not being perceived by me or perhaps by anyone else? So, how do you know that the top of Mount Everest is still existing when nobody's perceiving it? And Berkeley's answer to that was, well, God. God perceives everything all the time, and therefore everything does continue to exist. We probably wouldn't kind of accept that argumentation. We might perhaps say something like, because there are satellites traveling around the world, taking pictures of it all the time, it continues to exist. But actually, we'd probably reject the whole line of reasoning, and we would be right to do so, because it's a kind of a trap. But anyway, another question is, if everything is based on our sense perceptions, then we have to ask, how can we have concepts for unperceivable things? After all, we go around a lot of the time talking about things that are not directly perceived. Whether these are scientific concepts like electrons, or whether they are social concepts like, to take the example I used yesterday, if you say somebody is the husband of somebody, you can't kind of perceive their husbandness from their physical structure. So how do we actually build up concepts of things or properties or attributes which are not directly perceived? And again, actually cognitive linguistics does have an answer to this question. And the answer is that we use imaginative metaphoric extensions. We start off with concrete domains of experience which are directly experienced, they are embodied, they are experienced in our bodies, and through a metaphoric extension we understand other domains as well. And so, for example, it's claimed that we understand concepts of time by analogical metaphoric extension from concepts of space and motion. And that hypothesis is one that I criticized in detail and concretely in one of my earlier lectures. In other words, I do agree that cognitive semantics does have answers to these problems, but I am dubious about whether these answers are good enough to really give us socially shared language. Because in the last and final analysis, they all rest upon the idea that there is some kind of experiential convergence between individual minds, and they don't start off from the point of view that that there is something shared, primordially and fundamentally shared about meaning, shared intersubjectively. And that's why, in my previous lecture 3 and now, I propose a kind of synthetic solution between, as a way of trying finally to get beyond this kind of opposition between subjectivism and objectivism. And I'm really only going to run through this very quickly because I have talked about it in much more detail, what it actually means in other lectures. But my purpose here is to actually highlight the way in which I think that we need to achieve a sort of synthesis between these opposites in order to have an adequate theory of meaning in language. And the synthetic solution is essentially to preserve the distinction which we find in objectivism between psychological and discursive concepts. In other words, I actually think that Frege was right to say that the senses of language, okay, are not identical to individual psychological concepts. And as I said in lecture 3, I think that such senses are actually equivalent to what the philosopher Kant called discursive concepts. Where Frege was wrong was to place them in some kind of strange, ideal Platonic realm. So what we actually have to do is to replace this Platonic ideal realm with the notion of intersubjective normative agreement. Meanings are, in a very real sense, social. They are a matter of convention within a language community, and language is a system of conventions. Now, this is very important because although cognitive linguists such as Ron Laniker do actually use the term convention, yeah, they say that language is a conventional system of symbolic assemblies. There is not really much exploration of what this notion of convention actually means. And in fact what we have to say is that conventions can only exist in communities. You can't have a convention which merely belongs to a single speaker-hearer. And as I said in an earlier lecture, that's in essence the Wittgensteinian argument against the possibility of a private language. And if you accept the Wittgensteinian argument against a private language, and if you accept that conventions are properties of practices in a community, then you are bound to reject the Chomskyan notion of the primacy of the internal language. And finally, let's talk about this notion of reference. We owe the distinction between sense and reference to Frege. Reference has more or less disappeared out of cognitive linguistics. And the reason is people like cognitive linguists like Lakoff consider that the distinction between sense and reference is one which has its roots in objectivist, formalist philosophies of language, which is correct. But my point is, we still need a distinction between sense and reference, and we can get it if we get rid of the objective idealism of the Fregean distinction and focus instead upon the conventionality in an intersubjective context of the senses which underlie reference. And we also have to underline the fact that reference is not a relationship between abstract symbolic objects and reality, but actually is an achievement of people in communicative situations. Okay? So reference is an achievement of people, not an attribute of meanings. Again, if you want an expansion of that, you'd have to go back to one of my earlier lectures, I think lecture 4, where I looked at the development thanks very much, in human infancy, and by implication in human evolution of reference in an intersubjective field. All of this means that I am arguing for a socio-cultural variant of Fregean sense and of the distinction between sense and reference. And I find, I'm repeating here something that I said earlier, a quote, because I find it really absolutely great to find in the work of Karl Bühler more than half a century ago, actually getting on for 70 years ago, this quotation. Plato called objects that manifest similarities to linguistic meanings ideas. That we have transformed the eternal and immutable into intersubjective only needs to be said in order to exclude misunderstandings. And intersubjectivity, as I argued yesterday, is the fundamental basis of social facts and social institutions as argued by classical sociologists like Durkheim and modern philosophers of mind and language like John Searle. Well, I'm not sure that Searle actually does argue that, but he does at least refer to social facts and social institutions. Okay, so that sort of brings me to the end of my discussion of subjectivism and objectivism, but the other terms which occur in the title of this lecture are realism and relativism. And I just want to talk about what we mean by that. Realism is essentially the proposition that there exists a mind-independent reality to which at least some of our concepts and utterances refer. Now, not necessarily all of them, because it's quite clear that some of our concepts and utterances are mind-dependent. In other words, they're dependent on the way that we think. They are, in a strict sense, human constructions. So if I refer, for example, to the winner of a football league championship, okay, then I'm talking about an institutional fact rather than a mind-independent fact of the physical world. But still, realists insist that in some kind of sense, at least part of the world is independent of our conceptualizations and exists out there. For philosophers, the most common form of realism is objectivist realism. In other words, you combine realism with objectivism because objectivism suggests that science is all about discovering these true propositions about a mind-independent, objective reality. But it's not necessary that it should be always combined in that way. And Lakoff and Johnson are quite right in insisting that their particular approach can be called experiential realism. Okay? Now, it's true that there may be some tension between what I've identified as the subjectivist roots of the Lakoff and Johnson philosophy and its realism, but nonetheless, even on the basis of an essentially empiricist philosophy of mind, you can still actually believe, you can still posit that, as it were, the world that causes the perceptions is a real world. The only thing is, you can't prove it, but I'm not sure that anybody can prove it. However, I also think that there is an important twist here, and there is an important way in which cognitive semantics can give us a different take on realism, which goes also beyond experiential realism, and which draws a clear distinction between the cognitive functional version of realism and objectivist realism. In objectivism, as you know from the earlier slides, the relationship of reference is one between expressions and what are called states of affairs in the world. And a state of affairs is supposed to be something completely objective. And is that okay? Can you hear? And a state of affairs is meant to be something entirely objective, and again from this kind of God's eye view, or no perspective whatsoever. My point, however, is that actually people, okay, remember I said that it's people that do the referring, it's human communicators that do the referring, and not the words on their own. People, I think that's perfect, right? Yeah, very nice, yes. um, People do not actually refer to objective states of affairs in their ordinary discourse. In fact, what they do is they refer to linguistically construed situations. And here we kind of join up with a fundamental proposition of cognitive semantics, that language is all about conceptualization and construal, and is essentially perspectival. That point of view is essential to it, subjectivity is essential to it. Not in the subjectivist sense, but in the sense that we are subjects in the world. So a little bit more elaborately, linguistic reference is to linguistically conceptualized referential situations, not to states of affairs in the objectivist sense. And so the position I've taken in these lectures, if you want a simple summary of it, is realist, but it's a kind of ecological and perspectival realism as opposed to an objective realism. And also perhaps as opposed to Lakoff's more empiricist version of experiential realism. Now, before I move on to relativism, I just want to come back to this notion of the mind-brain, which is so beloved of Fodor and of some other philosophers. I think it's a conundrum. I think it's an insoluble puzzle. And I actually think just by having this notion of the mind-brain, many philosophers of mind have actually basically done nothing more than increase the confusion about the nature of mind. And I'll tell you what the problem is. This brain that I have is my brain. This one here, yeah. That brain that you've got out there, every single individual one of you, is your brain. I cannot share your brain, and you cannot share my brain. Okay? And for the life of me, I can't imagine any technology which would enable us to really share brains. What a nightmare. Because the brain is actually part of the individual organism. On the other hand, however, I can share your thoughts, most obviously through the medium of language. And I regularly do share your thoughts in the sense that how would we be able to communicate if we were not able to share thoughts? Share thoughts, share feelings, share experiences. And mind is actually shared, and mind is social in a very fundamental sense. And the point about the brain is that it's a kind of bit of biology which is there to support the social mind. And interest, I mean, again, you know, there's an awful lot we could say here. One of the things that we could say is actually that I think that, that it is a fundamental property of human cognition that it is fundamentally intersubjective and about the shared mind. And I do think that the majority of other species are highly limited in the extent to which they can socially share the mind. In fact, for most other species, to the extent that we can talk about them having minds, which I think we can, those minds are really manifestations of the individual organismic brain. But we humans have actually evolved into essentially intersubjective beings. And of course, our biology supports this intersubjectivity. Of course, the primary vehicle in adults for sharing thoughts is language, which is a fundamental vehicle for the shared mind. And I just want to repeat here, or review again, another theme which has come up in these lectures. What do we mean by language being a vehicle for the sharing of mind? Well, there are two kind of views of this. One is very traditional. It certainly goes all the way back to Aristotle, but we find it in empiricist philosophers like Locke as well. And I call it the transmission view, that language is a means of transportation of thoughts from one thinker to another. The linguist Reddy talked about the conduit view of language, and again, it's cited by George Lakoff in his book Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. Reddy criticized this conduit metaphor. What actually is interesting is that if you go back and you look at the philosophical writings of Locke in the 17th century, you find the conduit metaphor absolutely explicitly stated. He says something like, language is the great conduit for the transmission of thoughts from one person to another. I think this is wrong because, again, it kind of suggests that we have to sort of transfer individual mental contents from one head to another, rather than starting from the point of view that actually language is a sort of a collaborative and coordinative action in an intersubjective field. There is another metaphor, which is also quite ancient, which is what we might call the toolkit metaphor. And again, this underlies why I prefer to talk about a cognitive functional approach in linguistics, in which language is seen as a means for coordinating and transforming the shared intersubjective universe of discourse of interlocutors, and as a consequence of this, also the intrasubjective cognitive processes and capacities of individual speaker-hearers in a Vygotskian kind of fashion. Okay, well, I don't know how much of this I'm going to get through in the end. But I did say that I would address the issue of relativism. Relativism is, I don't know what, I don't know what the kind of general sort of view is of relativism in China, or whether it even is a term that pops up in popular discourse in China. But where I come from, relativism has become almost a term of abuse. And it's seen as a sort of disease of the modern world, that it's almost as if we are unable to have any values anymore because we've all become relativists. And here's a quote from somebody. Relativism appears to be the only attitude acceptable to today's standards. The dictatorship of relativism, which does not recognize anything as definitive and has as its highest value one's own ego and one's own desires. And that's Pope Benedict XVI, making a fierce, as so many defenders of religious faith do, making an impassioned assault on everything modern, in which he counts relativism. So what is the target of papal wrath and anger? Relativism, according to the Pope, is identified with an attitude of anything goes, the notion that there is no truth of knowledge or ethics that is superior to any other, and the idea that relativism therefore leads inevitably to the rule of self-interest, hedonism, and libertinism, and amorality, and is therefore devoid of both sense and meaning and morality. Is this reasonable? Well, some philosophers have also criticized relativism for being paradoxical, and this is what's supposed to be the paradox of relativism. Relativism, it is said, denies the possibility of all truth claims, all and any truth claims. If everything is relative, nothing can be true. Relativism is therefore a claim about the nature of truth. Therefore, relativism, if true, cannot be true. And, you know, it's a nice logical argument, but unfortunately I think it's wrong. Because this criticism identifies relativism with what we might call deep skepticism. Deep skepticism being a sort of solipsism, actually, the idea that it is impossible to have any secure knowledge whatsoever. So in this kind of view, actually, for many philosophers, it seems that you've got to either have objectivism or you've got chaos. You know, that's the many philosophers really believe that if you let go of objectivism, you go into a kind of deep, skeptical, negative relativism, which leaves you completely floundering in matters both of knowledge and of ethics. And I think this is quite wrong, and I'll try and explain why. Anyway, this criticism, I'm saying, has as its target negative relativism, which I think has some more manifestations as well as the notion of, as well as skepticism, let's say. Some more manifestations of negative relativism include what I would call romantic multiculturalism, which consists of the assertion that it is not permissible to condemn the customs of cultural groups on the basis of external judgments of value. Now, I don't know what you think about this. I do think personally that there is a kind of relativism under which we can understand the contextuality of all judgments of value and withhold generalized condemnations, but the idea that it's not permissible ever under any circumstances to condemn the custom of any cultural group on the basis of external judgments of value is itself a kind of total ethical skepticism. The denial of universal human rights is also a kind of negative relativism. It is often said that freedom of expression, democracy, and so forth are inconsistent with this or that cultural tradition. I do know that this is an issue which has particular resonance in China, but I think that the assertion of the incompatibility with any particular ethical value with a certain tradition is a form of negative relativism. It's a negative relativism which simply says you can't make a judgment at all. I disagree with this. Judgments are possible. The denial of scientific rationality. There is a form of negative relativism which says that scientific theories are no more valid than folk beliefs. Time to sort of unpack the reasons in detail why I find all these forms of negative relativism wrong. The point that I'm trying to make is essentially that they are these manifestations of what I call negative relativism are all kind of attitudes or, I think attitudes is the right word. Attitudes which are often kind of taken to be what relativism is all about. And I don't think that is what relativism, at least the kind of what I would call positive relativism, which I'm going to go on and recommend. I don't think it consists of those sorts of negative relativist attitudes and statements. All of the propositions stated above cannot be tested scientifically. They are a priori judgments, and they are essentially negative judgments. Before going any further, let's now undertake a brief history of relativism. I think the earliest statement of something like relativism that I know of is from the Greek philosopher Protagoras, who said, "Man is the measure of all things." In making this statement, he was opposing the Platonic view in which there are eternal and immutable forms, meanings, and values. "No," said Protagoras, "it is man who is the measure of all things. It is we that make meaning and value." This anti-Platonic claim suggests also that relativism in some ways is a variety of pragmatism. What is true is what works in some context or another. What is true is what enables us to carry on some kind of productive practice. And if contexts vary, so does truth in context. And this leads us to what I would call the positive relativist proposition, which is that the judgments, beliefs, and actions of individuals are comprehensible only against the background of their own culture and language. That's what I mean by positive relativism. And it is to be distinguished from negative relativism, because negative relativism says we should withhold having any judgments of our own about other people's judgments, beliefs, and actions. We don't have to withhold our own judgments. We don't have to, as it were, deny the possibility that we have another perspective as well. It just means that we cannot use our own canons as the sole arbiter of what other individuals or groups from other cultural and linguistic backgrounds are doing. And furthermore, the last of these claims, this one, that the judgments, beliefs, and actions of individuals are comprehensible only against the background of their own culture and language, is a hypothesis which can be investigated scientifically, at least to some extent. Perhaps not in every respect, but at least to some extent. Relativism in modern thought emerged in anthropology and linguistics as a reaction against 19th century social Darwinism. And more generally, as a reaction against the theoretical assumption of a universal pattern of cultural evolution, in which 19th century anthropologists believed that there was a universal progression from savagery to civilization and from irrationality to scientific rationality. 19th century thinkers identified a way of thinking which they called primitive thought. And they believed that primitive thought characterized both primitive people, or savages, but also they thought that primitive thought was a characteristic of children, and they also thought that it was a characteristic of mad people, of the insane. And I call this whole kind of notion that there is a sort of phylogenetic and ontogenetic progression from a sort of madness to a kind of rational sanity, the philocultural complex. It seems very odd from our standpoint that people really should believe this, but I do assure you that it is the case. And even in the writings, the early writings of Vygotsky, we find this identification between, for example, schizophrenic autistic thought and the thought, as he put it, of children. The most amusing kind of example of this that I've come across is from the philosopher Auguste Comte, who was a French philosopher often regarded as the father of positivism. And this poor guy, he himself suffered from psychiatric illness, probably bipolar disorder, or what used to be called manic depressive disorder. And it was reported that when he had a psychotic episode, he felt himself regress through various stages of metaphysics, monotheism, and polytheism to fetishism, and then, in the process of recuperation, watched himself mount again through the progressive changes of human consciousness, at once historical and individual, to positivism and health. So I don't know what you make of that, but what I can tell you is that part of this philocultural complex was the notion that different forms of religious thought could be ordered in terms of their kind of evolutionary primitiveness or advancedness, so that fetishism was the most primitive form of religion, and then you have monotheism as the most advanced form, to be followed by scientific positivism. This philocultural complex had an enormous legacy on psychological and linguistic and anthropological thinking, and also on social theory as well. Karl Marx, who is not usually thought of as being a reactionary thinker and was very much, in his own time, indeed, a progressive thinker, nonetheless hung on to the idea that all non-Western civilizations had some kind of degree of primitivity of the kind that he called Oriental despotism. And when he talked about Greek philosophy, he talked about Greek thought as representing the childhood of humanity. Sigmund Freud also absolutely believed in this philocultural complex, dating the birth of monotheism to the historical figure of Moses, and also believing that, as he did, that the Oedipus complex was a relic of the actual historical murder by sons of the primitive father. The anthropologist Lévi-Brühl had this notion of primitive thought as participation. He believed that primitive people were unable to make a distinction between their subjectivity and their ideas and the world around them, and that they therefore invested the whole world with kind of animacy. And he called this participation. I also use the term participation, by the way, but in a different sense. He later abandoned this theory to his credit, and decided it was stupid. But both Piaget and Vygotsky, in their early work, accepted the hypothesis of a generalized child primitive mentality. But then, again, both of them later abandoned this notion. So relativism actually developed, modern relativism in what I would call the scientific sense, developed as a reaction against this kind of this philocultural complex, which included within it the assumption of the assumption that that Western civilization was the kind of pinnacle of rationality which could be achieved by human thought. And then, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, along come people like Franz Boas, who was the father, I think, in a very real sense, of linguistic anthropology as it's practiced today. Boas builds upon the theories of Wilhelm von Humboldt, believing that languages actually express cultural and psychological diversity. He documents North American indigenous languages, and he does so without making the assumption that they were just mere primitive dialects. And he concludes that there is no such thing as primitive language. And Edward Sapir, who was, of course, Boas's student, expressed this in the following terms. The outstanding fact about any language is its formal completeness. Boas also, very interestingly, situates linguistics in a sort of interdisciplinary cognitive science. Of course, he would never have used that term because the term didn't exist in those days. But it is sobering to know that nearly 100 years ago, Boas was saying, the purely linguistic inquiry is part and parcel of a thorough investigation of the psychology of the peoples of the world. And note here the plural in peoples. Okay, he is recognizing diversity, and he is recognizing the, in principle, equality between all peoples in terms of their psychology and the forms of their language. Comparative anthropological psychology was also pioneered in Britain by figures such as W.H. Rivers and Sir Frederick Bartlett. But the lessons of Boas and his more relativistic approach, his break with philoculturalism, take a long time to filter through, especially to psychology. As late as 1965, we find an author, Tyler, writing this: between our clearness of separation of what is in the mind from what is out of it, and the mental confusion of the lowest savage of our own day, there is a vast interval. That's the, Lévi-Bruhl's theory of participation still being actually expressed as recently as 50 years ago. And it was that kind of thing that led George Miller, who was one of the great pioneers of cognitive psychology, to say, most psychologists are poorly prepared by education or acculturation to understand the mental processes of people living in traditional cultures, or to grasp the fact that such people's experiences have not required them to develop and use many of the cognitive strategies that our Western experience has instilled in us. Here's an example. Here's some work by a cultural psychologist, Michael Cole. And he's interviewing language consultants or participants, if you like, in Liberia in West Africa. And these people are farmers, okay? And he gives them this problem. He sets them this problem using names which are current in the culture. And what he's trying to get at is verbal logic or syllogistic reasoning, okay? The experimenter says, Flumo and Yak Palo always drink rum together. Flumo is drinking rum. Is Yak Palo drinking rum? And the consultant says, Flumo and Yak Palo drink rum together, but the time Flumo was drinking, the first one, Yak Palo, was not there on that day. The experimenter repeats the question and gets the same answer again. And then the experimenter says, what's the reason? In other words, what's the reason that Yak Palo was not there on that day? And the consultant says, the reason is that Yak Palo went to his farm on that day and Flumo remained in town on that day. That's from Cole and colleagues in 1971. Now the question here is, why is it that the language consultant or participant are not giving the same kind of result that Western educated participants give to this kind of question, which contains a simple logical syllogism. Okay, that the syllogism being that Flumo and Yak Palo always drink rum together. Flumo is drinking rum, therefore, logically, Yak Palo should be drinking rum too. But the consultant doesn't say that. In fact, the consultant goes out of his way to make, as it were, a statement which is the opposite of what you would derive from syllogistic reasoning. Why? Well, what the consultant has done is to construct a sort of hypothetical scenario. And now if you just think this through a little bit more, why would anybody be asking that kind of question? I mean, if it's always the case that these two guys drink rum together, why would you be asking if on a particular occasion they're drinking rum together or not? The reason must surely be that there's something special about that occasion which leads you to ask the question. And then that leads the consultant to construct a hypothetical scenario in which one of the guys went to his farm and one guy stayed in town, and therefore they couldn't be drinking rum together. Okay. In other words, what we can actually say about this is that the kind of the discursive construction of possible reasons why the usual ordinary state of affairs doesn't occur takes precedence over decontextualized reasoning. And that's essentially Cole's answer. He says decontextualized reasoning is a particular socialized skill which is largely inculcated through education of a particular form. That's also, incidentally, the answer that in the end Vygotsky came to give as well. All of this emphasizes the vast importance of context. Cole et al.'s research, which involved categorization, memory, and learning, demonstrated that the choice of materials, according to the familiarity, unfamiliarity of objects and categories, and also the verbal formulation of the task, whether categories are explicitly named, whether instructions or questions were given, could differentially disadvantage either non-literate Liberian or literate American groups. The great thing about this research was that he showed how if you present tasks in certain ways which actually get at the everyday skills of the non-literate peoples, you will find that they perform better than literate, college-educated Western participants. Many developmental psychologists reached similar conclusions in researching children's reasoning during the 1970s and thereafter. Context plays a role both in cultural variability and in universality. I'm going to quote Michael Cole again. Cultural differences in cognition reside more in the situations to which particular cognitive processes are applied than in the existence of a process in one cultural group and its absence in another. Okay? So it's not as if reasoning is something that Western subjects can do and which non-literate African farmers can't do. It is all to do with the situation in which particular strategies are devolved. And in that context, it's very interesting to compare Cole, what Cole writes, with what Boas said long, long ago. Boas actually wrote, "The existence of a mind absolutely independent of conditions of life is unthinkable." Well, it was unthinkable for him, but of course for some objectivist, rationalist philosophers, it's not unthinkable at all. They actually do think that the mind is absolutely independent of conditions of life in some kind of way. But Boas then goes on to say, the functions of the human mind are common to all humanity. And that's exactly the same distinction that Michael Cole draws between the situations in which particular cognitive processes are applied, what Boas refers to as conditions of life, as opposed to the existence of a process in one cultural group and absence in another, which Cole does not believe in, and neither does Boas, because he says the functions of the human mind are common to all humanity. And this brings us to our old friend linguistic relativity. And I really need to be drawing to a close, I think. This is what Worf said. This is a quote from 1940 on the hypothesis of linguistic relativity. Users of markedly different grammars are pointed by their grammars toward different types of observations and hence different evaluations of externally similar acts of observation, and hence are not equivalent as observers, but must arrive at somewhat different views of the world. But also, elsewhere, Worf writes, and again, I've said this before, but I want to, emphasize this again. Worf also says, Gestalt psychology gives us a canon of reference for all observers, irrespective of their languages or scientific jargons, by which to break down and describe all visually observable situations and many other situations also. Now, in my second lecture, I paid particular attention to the origins in Gestalt psychology of many of the concepts of cognitive linguistics or cognitive functional linguistics. And I find it very interesting that Worf also referred to this. So the interesting thing is that Worf, who is well known, or is best known, for his principle of linguistic relativity, also believed in a kind of universality as well. Gestalt psychology as a canon of reference. Thus, he also believed that in some fundamental way, the functions of the human mind are universal, but their particular situational, contextual application is variable. And in this case, the situational application includes the actual language that you speak, the specific way in which that language semiotically and symbolically mediates cognition in the world. Is there a truth about relativism? I think so. I think that a major failing of most 20th century psychological theories was their restriction to studies of the Euro-American mind, language, and culture. I think that if we're interested in understanding what is universal in the human mind, we can't just start from one language and culture. We have to conduct comparative studies. Psychologists, linguists, and anthropologists all have to learn from each other. That's perhaps the reason why I've emphasized the interdisciplinarity of cognitive functional linguistics throughout these lectures. But we also have to learn from the diverse peoples that we work with in the way in which Boas suggested. Positive relativism, resting on a recognition of the importance of contextuality at all sorts of different scales, represents a methodological necessity as well as a testable hypothesis about cognitive variation and the constraints upon it. And finally, each of the world's 4,000 or more languages, although it is very much a diminishing stock of languages, but there are still definitely more than 4,000 of them. Each of them represents a unique source of evidence and resource for human identity as well as cognition. And this imposes ethical responsibilities upon us as researchers regarding the treatment of the cultural and linguistic diversity of our own species. Yes, I think I'm going to finish here because I've been talking for quite a long time, and it's a good moment to stop these 10 lectures. And I think maybe I will close by just saying one other thing. The title of the first lecture was something like Language, Culture and Cognition, Independent or Interdependent. And I hope by now that you've actually got my main message in all of this, that actually I think language, culture and cognition are deeply interwoven with each other, and in that sense absolutely interdependent phenomena which require interdisciplinary investigation. And with that I'll say thank you very much.